Welcome. I'm Daniel Carlton, artist in residence with Harlem Is. In fact, for 20 years, I've been a part of the Community Works and New Heritage Theater family, helping to celebrate the cultural history of Harlem through school programs, landmark exhibition, and multicultural workshops and performances. Today, we debut the Harlem Is Healing Dialogue series. Beginning weeks after the pandemic broke out, Community Works interviewed over 40 honorees who were helping Harlem heal from the ravages of the pandemic, to find ways to reduce violence and hate, and to seek more equitable racial justice. Their stories were posted on Facebook, Instagram, and now are part of Harlem Is website, www.harlem-is.org. Today's host is the brilliant Deirdre Hollman, education consultant to Community Works for 20 years, former director of the Junior Scholar Program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and founder of the Black Comics Collective. She will be in conversation with the amazing Shirley Taylor, education director at the world-famous Apollo Theater. But before we begin, I would like to share a tribute that I wrote for our heroes during the pandemic as a tribute for those community arts and educational leaders that helped us heal. I'm reading this from my phone and shifting on my computer, so if I don't always make eye contact, forgive me. Harlem is history that dances side by side with innovation, is art that goes beyond decoration, is demands your spirit's participation, is dance as flight, is feet with wings out of sight, is music with a beat from the rafters of churches to the sounds of the street, is throw your prayers or cares into the air, is wave them with your expressive hands everywhere, is healing, because in this now uptown, a pandemic lifts the systematic vulnerability of so many. Our beloved village hit hard by an invisible enemy, virus sweeping through the very air with the ferocity of a storm that changed the very atmosphere. And the only thing that is clear is to heal, is to reveal what needs to be immediately done, and the forward direction that heroes have to run. A frontline community gets to work, not for the glory, but because this is when they join the story, going beyond the very real trepidation to a selfless response to the situation. Because Harlem is a place of practical magic, never giving in to the finality of tragic. Harlem is healing, is spirit, is gathering, is yes. The spirit meets community, meets advocacy, like talking drums with faith as the power. We will get through this moment in time, this now, this hour, because Harlem is healing, is so many more. Keep us thinking and believing, achieving, and dreaming. For those who have answered the call with respect and gratitude, we celebrate y'all.
So greetings, everyone. My name is Deirdre Hollman, and it's my pleasure to be a part of the Harlem Is Healing Dialogue series, an extension of Community Works and New Heritage Theater's Harlem Is Healing online exhibition that you can visit at www.harlemis.org. My guest today is the lovely Shirley C. Taylor, who is the Senior Director of Education at the Apollo Theater. She's also my neighbor, as we are both residents of Harlem, and really a visionary educator, artist, thinker that I'm so proud to be in your orbit, Shirley. And I'm proud to talk to you today a little bit about Harlem and the work that you do. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in your orbit, Deirdre, and to see you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. To get us started, I want to invite you to tell us a little bit about yourself, Shirley, because you're definitely more than the role that you hold at the Apollo. And so how about you tell us a little bit about your journey to the Apollo? How did you come into education as a field? What did you study, and kind of what has informed you as you've grown and matured?
So it's interesting because my journey to the Apollo really does begin, as my life begins here in New York City. I was born here in New York City, and particularly my mother came to New York from the South. My dad did as well, but my mom came to New York to dance in the 1930s when she was about 16 years old. And so she definitely was interacting with the Apollo and with some of the performers there long before I came into the picture. But I grew up here in New York City, just in the area just below Harlem, which is now I think called Manhattan Valley. So it's that area, 108th Street and Central Park West. I am a public school kid through and through. Attended neighborhood schools, and then when it was time for me to go to high school, I went to the High School of Art and Design in Midtown, and I wanted very much to be a fashion designer. That is what that's a career that I was familiar with. I was surrounded by a lot of creative people, including people in my own family. I come from a family of singers and musicians. I know how to carry a tune. I know a lot about music, but I wanted to do my own thing, and my own thing was visual arts. And at that time, it was fashion design and photography. So I, grew up, New York City kid, very much with the arts at my fingertips and very much engaged in experiencing the arts, whether it was the performing arts or whether it was, going to museums and galleries. And so I attended the High School of Art and Design. And when it was time for me to graduate, I just kind of had this shift, in me about, fashion. What does that mean? How, become a fashion designer? Like, I want to do something really meaningful. I want to save the world, right? That's what you want to do when you're that age, I suppose. At least I did. And so I was looking for something more meaningful. And there were also a lot of teachers in my family. And so, the idea of me becoming a teacher, of course, pleased my mom considerably. And, I was on the fence about it for a long time. I thought about social work. I ended up going to a community college, giving myself a couple of years to kind of figure out what it was I wanted to do, and settled on majoring in communications. And so I ended up going to CCNY, majoring in liberal arts and sciences, but focusing in communications and public policy, and also filmmaking. And then, a moth to the light, found my way to the art department at CCNY, and just, had that feeling in my body, like, art. Yes, art has been part of my life forever, and I really can't shake this. And so I decided that when I finished my bachelor's degree, that I would stay at CCNY and pursue my master's degree in fine arts in painting, knowing full well that I probably would not find a job being a painter or be able to support myself being an artist. But at that age and at that time, I just took advantage of it, just go ahead and do it and then figure the rest of it out later. And so I graduated with my MFA and went about looking for a job, decided, to again look at teaching as a career course, and was on the verge of being hired as a teacher at an elementary school in my neighborhood on the Upper West Side at the time, and saw an ad in the Village Voice. This was back in the 80s, and the Village Voice at that time had classifieds.
Yes, you're dating yourself with the Village Voice.
You could find a job, you could find an apartment. I found, a great apartment in the Village Voice, but I found this ad for a job, and it had two words that just really, struck a chord with me: arts and education. And I didn't really know what that was. It ended up being with the Artist in Residence program at the New York Foundation for the Arts. And I was introduced to the world of arts administration and began to understand that, while I was in high school, at a specialized high school, we knew about the financial problems that New York City was having at the time. And our school was also threatened with closing, but I didn't realize that the arts had been taken out of the many public schools, that, having an art class was something special depending on the school that you went to. And I really, decided in that moment, like, I can't imagine that. I cannot imagine young people growing up in this city and not having the opportunities that I had. And so I ended up moving from the New York Foundation for the Arts to Arts Connection, which the New York Foundation for the Arts served a statewide audience. Arts Connection served New York City-based schools. And that is how I really kind of broke into arts education administration and got my start in the field. But I was between jobs and trying to figure that out. And someone called me and said, Laura Greer is back in New York City. She's the VP of programming at the Apollo Theater. And the Apollo Theater is looking to build out its education programming. She's looking for a consultant. And I was like, oh, that would be really interesting because, as I mentioned, I was kind of born into the Apollo. It was one of those places that, growing up, I'm the youngest of three girls. I grew up with my two sisters. They were both teenagers when I was born. They had major babysitting duties on the weekends. And they took me with them wherever they went, whether it was, to go up to the schoolyard to watch the basketball games or go to the Apollo Theater. And so it felt to me like every Saturday we were at the Apollo. And, as a young child, I got to see, all of the people who now we recognize as legends,
Right.
More on the stage of the Apollo, to be in that environment of, at that time, this is in the 60s, the Apollo would have a movie, which I loved. Movie, there was a concession stand. It was a sensory experience for me as a child. The smell of the hot dogs, the popcorn, and then, the movie ending, the darkened theater, and then behind the screen. And of course, I'm there with, my sisters who are teenagers and other teenagers from the community, actually from our block. And we were usually sitting if not in the front row, very close to it, right?
Right.
And so I remember seeing the lights of the bandstands behind the screen as the movie was ending, and the feeling of the excitement, is building. It's like you can hear the instruments tuning up. And I always tell people that my sensibilities as an artist, and I would say also as, as an arts administrator, have been shaped by two major institutions, primarily the Black church, the Southern Baptist Church, actually, on 108th Street, and the Apollo Theater, because that's where I got to experience, the theater of the church and spirituality, the music, and then the music at the Apollo and the theatricality of the performance and the lights and the sound and all of that, all of the things that, come together to make the show. It was a really interesting moment for me to be asked to look at what the Apollo was doing with this education programming and to come up with scenarios for how it might expand. The Apollo wanted to add an internship program to its offerings and really seriously bring young people into the fold of the Apollo. Laura and I would always talk about, how we're not going to be here. So, so many years from now, who's going to take our place, right? We really were on a mission to make sure that young people, particularly in the Harlem community, knew about the Apollo, knew about its history, knew what it was, where it was, and felt like they were part of the Apollo experience. So that kind of leads me up to where I am now, continuing to shape education programming at the Apollo and, if I'm looking at it in a very mystical way, is this place that has always been with me. And that has helped to kind of shape how I see the world. And it's just such an honor to be in a space where I can help ensure the continuing legacy of the Apollo.
I love that. Thank you for taking us on that journey, because what I hear is coming from this very organic experience with arts and culture from your family, from your upbringing in New York, and even through your college experiences. One thing that kind of unites your story is this kind of appetite for making sure that arts connect with individuals, right? Mm-hmm. And that it goes hand in hand with what the arts can elicit from individuals, particularly young people, but what it also does to kind of uplift and inspire communities. And seeing you develop programs that make sure that what institutions are presenting are really getting into the community, like getting into schools, touching young people, creating, learning opportunities for professional careers in the arts. It all makes sense through your own experience, your own hands-on experience with the arts. So I wonder, from your view within the work that you're able to do now, like you're at the seat where you get to decide what types of programs are being created to both educate Harlem, the school children here, the adult community members, teachers here, but also folks outside of the Harlem community. You're also representing Harlem to audiences that aren't local. I wonder how you see your role as part of kind of this grand mission to keep the story of this community alive.
What we say in Apollo education is that the story of Harlem goes hand in hand with the story of the Apollo. Right. And that the Apollo still exists in this community really says something about the relationship between the community then and now, and the theater in its earliest periods, and the fact that it's still almost 90 years still standing. What we try to do is to really position the story of Harlem and what has happened in Harlem and what is happening in Harlem in a way that references who is in Harlem and why are they here. What comes to mind for me is when we first started to look at doing school programs at the Apollo, and I mean developing partnerships with schools, we had to look no further than right across the street, CS 154, our neighbor. And at the time, the Apollo was in the midst of working with Columbia to collect oral histories about the Apollo. And Columbia had done a program in Chinatown after 9/11, where they had young people interview older adults in the community, right? To really understand, like, what is Chinatown, who is in Chinatown, and, how is this community impacted by what's going on here now? And so we follow suit by creating a program, an oral history program for the students at 154, which was built around knowing your community, knowing this place where you live and go to school. And I have to say that what I see increasingly happening over the years is that so many students are not, the families are just not able to afford to live in Harlem, which is another, I think, we can have a different discussion about that. But if even if you don't live here, you go to school here. And so the students at 154, most of them, what they knew about the Apollo was they tint our schoolyard. They throw a big party and we can't use our schoolyard. And buses pull up in front of that place and people get off, and they're not necessarily people who look like us. And they did not have a lot of information about the Apollo. And so we set about working to change that. And again, bring them into the Apollo in a way that says, but this is also yours, right? This is also yours. So we connected students at 154 with a group in Harlem called the Significant Elders, which was established by Malika Lee Whitney. So it's been 12, maybe 13 years now that program has been going on. And the students would interview the elders, and the elders would tell them about their lives and how they got to Harlem and what they do in Harlem now, so that they weren't just getting the history. The history is important, but also, you're meeting this elder who is still a political activist. Like, they're telling you about how they came to Harlem. Maybe I came to Harlem, I was born in South Carolina. I came here, in the 1940s or 50s, and this is what it was like here. This is what New York was like. This is what I experienced, as a Black woman or a Black man. Here's some things that you should know. So it's all of the, I was discriminated against because of the color of my skin. But also, I became interested in making sure that people voted. And so that's what I decided to do, is to become an advocate for getting out the vote and for organizing people around voting. And I'm still doing that today. And I am 70, 80 years old, So again, it's connecting with the history, but also what is happening now. What is happening now and who's making it happen now.
I appreciate that story for two reasons. One, that same ethos about educating young people about the stories, the histories, the legacies in their own backyard. That's the whole ethos of the Harlem Is project, right? Yeah. This Harlem Is Healing program and exhibition series is a part of that. It's about saying, let's look in our own backyards and find out who are those people who are working to, heal this community, who are invested in the health, wealth, and well-being of this community, and not just in an abstract way, in a very on-the-ground way. And so there are a lot of similarities there, but it also reminds me of my own journey, because I started in the arts as well. Before I came into education, I studied art history in undergrad at
What period did you study? What period?
Modern art. Modern art was my thing. What really inspired me about modern art was modern America and the modern world, and that big shift that we all took globally in the late 19th and 20th century, right? So all of the stories that are tied into hit the history of that really broad, those two broad centuries, I found myself studying so many layers of human civilization through the arts. And so I loved studying art history. I came to New York to become a museum educator. Took a sidestep into producing music videos and film. But it became a part of what informed me later, because I started working in an after-school program with a friend of mine who was an acting teacher in a school in the Bronx. And I kind of had my aha moment when I saw what it was like for children to really be making their own art, to be telling their own stories, to be not only studying folks who were making films and doing theater presently and in the past, but then to give them the tools to do and make theater and to do and make a gallery show of their own art and painting. And so that combination of the historical study and the maker aspect of the arts, like tell your story, use these tools, that's in my own story. And I ended up working with Community Works, producing school programs across the city, doing just this neighborhood study, this community learning through the arts. But then I later ended up at the Schomburg Center doing education programs there, kind of drawing from the cultural wealth in the archives, bringing young people, teachers, community members in to study and make parallels to their lived experience. And so it's kind of this interesting circle between what you've done and are doing, what I've done and am doing, and what Community Works as a whole has done and is doing. And it's exciting because even though, I mean, we've partnered and worked together in different ways, but to see that there are multiple people on this same mission to make sure that the arts are impacting, our communities at its root. Because to me, at the root are young people, right? I might invert that analogy and say at the root are our elders who've already, fertilized the soil for us, and then making sure that knowledge kind of makes it and regenerates itself, through educating young people. And so what have you witnessed in terms of the impact of that kind of teaching and learning here in Harlem? How have you maybe witnessed how the arts have transformed the life of a student or a young adult because of their experience at the Apollo?
Oh, multiple ways. We've had about, as I mentioned, we've been at CS working with, in partnership with CS 154 now for more than a decade. We also work with Watley High School. Those are two of our partner schools. And then with our internship program, we've had about 200 young people come through that program. They've come from all over the city, but many of them have been, members of the Harlem community as well. So it varies. I can look to some who have definitely, I'm thinking about one young woman who lives in Harlem who came through the internship program, and she is a visual artist. She has her master's degree now. She's a visual artist, a very serious visual artist. I think of one young man who I believe is still teaching with Alvin Ailey. Dance was his passion, and he decided that you don't just kind of you take and you grow it, but you also give back. And both of those examples, these are people who decided to also teach and work with students either in school or in after school programs. We currently have a production coordinator working with us who came through our internship program, and she's a dynamic stage manager and coordinator. And so, it's really seeing them find their space, right? Find where they belong. Just as we, you're talking about the pathways that we've taken to land in this space of, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do and where I'm supposed to be, is really recognizing the young people that, you're on a path. You may not see it all now, but we will be a stepping stone to help you get there.
I love that, because I see what the connection between, that first that education and that opportunity to learn about things, how the world works, how theaters work and how different institutions work. But it becomes a career builder, which then becomes a community builder, because then there will always be, people of color, people of diverse backgrounds working in the arts, and even in positions where, as administrators and directors, they're funding projects to kind of regenerate the opportunities for young people to study and learn and develop careers in the arts. So it's this cycle of community investment and growth, right?
Right.
It's so necessary, and it's not always obvious, I think, to folks on the outside, is that that's what folks like you are doing with your time. It's not just the Thursday night and Saturday program. It's
Right.
it's this bigger vision of sustaining cultural production.
Right. And I guess, so I wanted to ask you about, with junior scholars, because what I find also what's intriguing for me is that we, in the work that we're doing, we can also create a whole new movement, right? By introducing young people to each other.
Mhm.
They have this thing in common, right? That, we're attracted to this program. Right, we're it's at the Schomburg.
Right.
We're really hyped about that, like what kind of art or history nerd are you that it's like, yeah, I want to be in the library.
That's right. On Saturday.
So have you seen that happen? Have you seen like a collective of young people just kind of come together through the programs that you run, and then kind of go forward outside of the program and continue to bond and work on projects together?
Very much so. The Junior Scholars Program at the Schomburg is coming up on its 20th anniversary. And being a part of that Saturday school from the beginning, and seeing the young people, like you said, not only find community in each other as a particular kind of nerd or scholar, just folks who want to learn new things, but finding community in that, but also building the relationships that I've seen them graduate high school and go to college together, and leave college, come out of college, and start careers that mirror some of the inspiration that they had while we were studying. But I've been able to witness how that community was so important to the young people who had a place in Harlem that they could go, not only to grow intellectually and academically, but artistically, and to build friendships that are long lasting. And I've seen young people go to college in pursuit of degrees and careers that were inspired by the work that we did together, whether it was becoming doctors, artists, actors, poets, published. I mean, students were inspired by poetry class and self-published their own poetry books. And so there's a big immediate benefit in communities really creating spaces like these for young people to just be learned, but also to produce. I mean, cultural production, I don't say the word lightly. It is the stuff of of culture, and working at a library with an archive that's collecting and documenting, creating exhibitions from the cultural production of generations before. I mean, this is the evidence of who we are and what we're thinking about and what we love and what we aspire to be through our letters and our books and our paintings and our music, our theater, our journalism. I mean, there are so many ways that young people can plug in to their own purpose by being given the opportunity to engage with the works of people who've come before them. I mean, it just generates so much possibility. That's what sustains communities. It's those young people, won't let a brick fall from that Schomburg building, like let something, come up in the news about someone wanting to move that building, or you just create such community and such loyalty that really helps to preserve our institutions. And that makes me think about something I wanted to talk with you about, particularly because the Schomburg Center, there was a great investment in the capital improvement and some of the internal systems at the Schomburg recently. And the Apollo Theater is turning the corner on the end of a long revitalization project, an expansive project that's actually increasing the square footage of the programmable space of the Apollo Theater. The Studio Museum in Harlem is engaged in similar projects, totally rebuilding and revamping, expanding its footprint and then its potential. I mean, Harlem Hospital, in the last 10 years has done that for itself. There's a lot of revitalization going on in some of these core pillar institutions in Harlem. What do you think that's doing for the community overall in terms of the idea of not only being able to sustain the community and its culture, but in being able to provide services that, keep folks alive, keep folks inspired?
It is very exciting to think that, the corridor of 125th Street will have these vibrant cultural centers. Caribbean Cultural Center.
Yes.
Right? National Black Theater.
Yes.
Studio Museum in Harlem, right? So I'm coming from the East, I'm working West. The theaters, the historic building, and then the two new theaters that are opening in the Young Victoria. And then of course, there is the center that Columbia has that is further west. What is most exciting for me is to think about how this might spur more smaller organizations to, first of all, the ones that are here and have been consistently doing the work off of the 125th Street corridor and certainly the 135th Street corridor. But, smaller organizations will also be in that glow, that revitalization, that vitality will help to feed these smaller arts organizations, as well as community organizations that have always been doing the work of the arts. Even how many times have we heard about people who took a writing class at the Kennedy Center, right here on 135th Street. So I think it's really good for Harlem. I think it's good that our young people will have choices, that they will have options, and that the options are not just, the bigger venues, but, Maisels has an amazing program.
Another one.
In filmmaking, and I mean, we could talk, we can move further uptown and talk about Dance Theater Harlem as well. So, I think that there's a lot of opportunity there.
It's the work that we do as both educators and administrators and producers that makes these institutions living history. They're not old buildings, they're not relics. These are thriving cultural centers.
Right.
And not just cultural centers where you can go and watch, but where you can go and participate, where you can go and create, where you can go and grow and heal. This is Harlem is Healing. And, the Black community has always rested upon, like you said, our churches, our spiritual centers, but also our cultural centers as places to be balms to our spirit, but also to find that community where you can, dream new solutions, create new art, and grow from there.
Mm-hmm. And be in the company of like-minded people. So often when we talk about education, we talk about young people, but there is, several years ago, I started a program called Livewire, which is primarily a discussion series, but we take it outside of the box. And it's an opportunity, again, to really talk about Black culture, talk about Black artists and Black performing arts, and to talk about history, and also to engage audience members. And it's, oftentimes, the ideas for the themes that we approach, they kind of spring up for me like, wow, we should really talk about how Black performers, there's a whole history of style and fashion, right? That is so different from anything else that we see in the world. I think it's Maxine Brown, talks about how people would still come up to her years after she performed at the Apollo and say, yeah, I remember seeing you perform and I remember the dress that you wore. Wow. So generating, like thinking about that, building an event around it, pulling people in who have the knowledge base, and then seeing who shows up in the audience because they're interested in this too. It's very exciting, and it's a form of people are engaged in education. So education is not just for young people; it impacts the lives of adults as well. It is sometimes a spiritual experience. For me, it's always a healing experience to, after the haste of getting a production prepared, and they do tend to be productions for me, to have people come up at the end of the evening and say, oh, I have a story to share with you, or I'm so glad that you did this, or, just, the appreciation that you get from people because you have engaged a topic or person or a genre or song, that they really truly care about and just feel so psyched about getting more information about.
It's cathartic, it's therapeutic. Sometimes we're making dreams come true for folks in the community who said, I never thought I would meet this actor or see this musician play live or have a chance to sit down and listen to this author talk about their book. But at these cultural centers where not only are those artists committed to performing and being seen in those places, but the community has a strong desire to kind of close the circle and just gather together and share those experiences. It's really quite magical. And that's what we feel at the end of the day, right? We feel some of that magic. I have two more questions for you, and I don't want to miss them because I really want to hear your take. And that is, what do you want people to understand about Harlem, its residents, its students, that's not necessarily apparent, to folks outside? I think, when we talk about Black excellence and when we talk about the ingenuity and innovation that we see in young people, it is genuine, it is real, it is evidence-based. So what would you want people to know about this community that they don't necessarily get to know through media?
Harlem is not a relic. It is not just about food. It's not just a place that you come to get soul food. The history is amazing and something that needs to be more widely acknowledged and taught and understood. But everything becomes history at some point. And so history is continuing to be made in Harlem. In addition to that, there is still, at the heart of Harlem, I feel, certainly, this is, when my family members moved from the South to the North, this is where they landed. They landed in Harlem, some of them on 7th Avenue, some of them landed right below Harlem. But Harlem was the place, it was the place that fed them. It was the place that they put down roots. And that is very important to understand, that there are still people in Harlem who have deep roots here. Deep roots is, it's not just about Oh, the light is so good. And, this is a great, it's accessible to mass transit. Yes, all of that is important. People have roots here.
Yes.
People count back generations in their families that have been in this neighborhood. I want people to know that Harlem is not monolithic, because, the people who live here and the people who really is established Harlem as the Harlem that we know today, they were not all coming from the same place. They were coming from different places. They represented different cultures. They represented different ideals. They represented, yes, they represented different religions. And, I think we're going through, it's a rough time right now. I see all this happening, but there's an energy here that remains, that I know I have felt for a long time. Can everyone feel it? I don't know. Yeah. I know you feel it.
I totally feel it, because we know what's possible. And when you know that to persevere, to be resilient, and to do what you do because the world needs it. You know what I mean? I mean, you're bringing up like the turn of the century and the Depression, and from that plight came the Renaissance, right? And not just in music and showmanship, as you're saying, but literally the arts. Incredible music was being written and made and performed, not just for the pleasure of people to just like look in on what the Black folks were doing, but for Black folks to tell their stories through that, to put their pain and their hope and their vision for a future into those songs, to grieve through those songs. You think about Billie Holiday, to do all of that emotional, spiritual work through our art. You can pick up on in the 1980s and the urban plight in the 80s and what was going on. It was like a downturn economically and socially. And from that came hip hop in Harlem and the Bronx, and the hip hop cultural movement produced a whole other global influence in arts and culture. And even now I do feel it, because it's somewhere between what's happening on the ground and now what's happening digitally. Like you were talking about your students and their projects. This pandemic, it might have set people indoors, but it didn't quiet creative spirits, because folks have stayed connected, have created new spaces and new ways of creating art, creating community, even in these hard, dire times. And so I stay inspired by that energy. I look to that energy to keep myself going.
And we have no idea what this will, the past year will render. But again, it's exciting to think about what the future holds. And particularly what we can do through the arts and culture, how we can help facilitate that birth, that rebirth, that new birth, that is definitely going to come.
Thank you. That's the perfect segue to my final question, is like, what do you want for the future of Harlem, Shirley?
Well, we mentioned hip hop and we just started a new program called the Digital Collective, which is really designed to train young people in digital production, whether it's for the stage, on the stage, off the stage, on the screen. And one thing that is really important in terms of the values that we've written for this program is letting young people know, getting them to understand that when, for example, they look at something like hip hop, that, you are looking at a cultural creation that came from you, where you sit right now, right? It came from people like you who were in the space that you're in right now.
Same space.
Okay. But it's being marketed to you as something that is outside of your experience, right? And so I'm really looking forward to coming up with more ways to just ingrain that, particularly in our young people, and giving them the space to create, but also the knowledge to create enterprise for themselves and for their communities, whether that be their family communities or where they live or the community that they just organically connect with.
Our visions are similar for the future. I think my eye on history and schooling and kind of the lack of, Black studies happening in K through 12 really makes my dream for the future of Harlem be freedom schools, like free access to the knowledge about who we are as a community, not only as individuals who've made it, but as like masses who've survived. And so that we can inspire young people in maker spaces to build the future. So again, I want to unlock the distance that young people and adults feel they have from our knowledge of self and our knowledge of community, because it's being brokered to us and folks are trying to tell us what we can and cannot learn about who and what we are, right? That's wrong. So I want to see freedom schools freely accessible to the community, on every corner, in any way that we can make these kinds of spaces, these free spaces for our learning and creativity and healing.
Oh, let's do it. Deirdre, anytime you and I have a conversation, there's some project that comes out of it. So
that's right.
Ready to go.
I'm ready to go too. Shirley, thank you for this conversation. I feel healed and inspired just through the ability to talk with you and to share ideas. So thank you so much.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And I too feel healed and energized. Yeah.
On behalf of viewers and Barbara Horowitz of Community Works and Vosa Rivers of New Heritage Theater Group, we say thanks to Deirdre and Shirley for this illuminating conversation. Please join us for more dialogues with community healers. Next up, Rena Valentin in conversation with artist Andrea Aurora. Finally, thanks to our key funders who have made this possible: Con Edison, Humanities NY, and Josh Horowitz. Thank you, everybody. Be safe, and we will see you uptown.